Good afternoon, all. I know people are still being admitted, so I'll vamp just a moment, but want to have maximum amount of time for Oriana's presentation and for questions and answers. That I thank everyone who's made the time to join us this afternoon, and thank the CSAC staff for handling the arrangements. Most of all, thank in advance Oriana Scala Mastro, who will give a presentation on hiding in plain sight, how China builds and exercises military power. That Oriana is a fellow at FSI, and she's affiliated primarily with CSAC and with the Asia Pacific Research Center. She specializes in international security, rising powers, and security policy in Northeast Asia. Oriana is a prolific commentator in journals such as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, as well as in newspapers and a variety of specialized publications. The talk today is drawn from her current book project, which she will describe. This will be her second book. Her first, entitled The Costs of Conversation, Obstacles to Peace Talks in Wartime, won the 2020 American Political Science Association International Security Section Best Book by an Untenured Faculty Member Award. Oriana is entitled to a much more fulsome introduction than I'm going to give you, but you've seen the biography as a part of the announcement. So I will cease talking in a moment so we can begin the talk. Oriana will speak for 20 to 25 minutes. That will be followed by a question and answer session. And we invite you to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A. The chat function has been disabled, and you may submit questions at any time. So not to detract any more from your time, Oriana, thank you for doing this, and the screen is over to you.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction and for everyone at CSAC for arranging this talk. As Tom mentioned, I am going to be discussing my current book project, and I'll give you some hints on the puzzle and what I'm looking at, and then I'll describe mostly some of the military cases, given the title of the talk today, though the book itself covers foreign policy, econ, and tech policy in addition to military strategy. So the title of my talk today is the tentative title of my book, Hiding in Plain Sight: How China Exercises and Builds Military Power. Now, I just want to give you just a brief overview to preface what I think is so interesting and puzzling about the rise of China. Some people don't really realize how much has changed in the past 25 years. I did a TV spot yesterday, and they said, like, can you tell us, has a lot changed in the past 50 years? And I was like, you don't have to go back 50 years. You can go back 20, 25 years, and we're in a completely different world. Here's the share of the global economy in the year 2000, in which the United States had 26% of the global economy as its GDP, and China had 3%, less than France at that time. You fast forward to 2019, and Chinese economy is over 16%, while the United States is kind of holding steady at 24%. They've also increased significantly military spending by 740% over this period of the mid-1990s until the late 2010s. This allowed them to go from a position in the Indo-Pacific in which China wasn't really a significant military threat to the United States. But a lot of people don't realize when they look back, they said, oh, maybe the United States, we missed it. We should have done something sooner. We should have realized China was a threat, in the mid-1990s. Well, the point is China wasn't a threat in the mid-1990s for a number of reasons. They had a navy that couldn't defend itself, so couldn't sail beyond the coastline. So this is before they started engaging in more operations in the South China Sea. Their pilots couldn't fly over water or at night, so we weren't really concerned about a Taiwan invasion at this time. And then you flash forward, here's the balance of power in 1999, you flash forward to 2020, and this is cut off on my screen. So I'm going to move it in and see screen share. Someone on the call, please let me know if you don't see the full screen. I see it now. But in 2020, you can see, even if you're not a military person, all the red stuff is the bad stuff China has to hurt us, and the blue stuff is the stuff that the United States has to hurt China. You can see that there was a huge difference over those time periods. Not only did China increase its economic power and its military power, but it also increased its political power. It increased its membership in international institutions. So you can see here, if you want to look at the mid-1990s, where they're a member of, maybe 40 types of institutions, it almost doubles by the time we get to today. They even didn't have normal relations with a lot of major powers until the mid-1990s, like South Korea. According to the Lowy Institute, who has a power index of position in Asia, China now ranks only number 2 to the United States in comprehensive power. And it's a close number 2, and that's largely because of the US military defense networks being so large. When you look at things like diplomatic influence, diplomatic networks, China is listed as number 1, surpassing the United States in foreign policy power. So I look at this, and to me, one of the biggest questions is, how did China manage to do this? Much of the literature that focuses on rising powers and how rising powers managed to reach great power status looks at the decisions of the great power, right? The great power made a mistake, right? We hear this a lot in US discourse as well. The great power fails to make correct balancing choices because of domestic politics, because of miscalculation. Maybe the great power accommodates the new power because they have similar interests or similar viewpoints. Or as one scholar, Josh Schifrinson, argues, if the great power is dealing with multiple threats, they have to allow some to rise, must choose which ones they're going to try to undermine. And that was the case of Great Britain, sort of allowing the United States to rise while it was dealing with the threats from Germany. And so there's this whole literature that basically doesn't look at rising power strategies. And it is actually extremely rare that a country rises to great power status. Since the 16th century, there's only 16 cases of a rising power attempting to reach that kind of status. And what I think is interesting is actually in 12 of those cases, they actually succeed in doing so. Now, in political science, the main assumption, if I ask, how does China build enough power to become a great power? The assumption is they do what great powers do, right? Why not? The great powers did certain things and made them powerful, just copy them. And so there's this understanding, and Kenneth Waltz has this famous quote of the sameness effect, that competition produces a tendency towards the sameness of competitors. And there's a lot of research, whether it is realists or constructivists, about imitation and mimicking and how this can build power, whether it's through military power or prestige in a more constructivist tradition. But what I argue is I take a look at this and I say, actually, maybe for most countries, copying the great power is a good idea, right? You're just trying to get so much prosperity or so much power. You're not trying to catch up. But for rising power, there's a lot of disincentives against emulation. First and foremost, if the rising power is going to catch up, it has to ensure that it does not spark a negative reaction on the part of the established hegemon, right? China very purposely knew it had to delay a competitive US response for as long as possible. And sometimes imitation directly challenges the equities of the hegemon. We can clearly see something as a threat when it's exactly what we do to build power and influence. And there's a lot of behavioral economics that shows this, that we tend to underestimate the effectiveness of other people's approaches when they're different from our own. To catch up, China also had to build power efficiently. It's not enough to build power if the United States is building power kind of at the same rate. If you're going to catch up, you have to do it more efficiently. And it's kind of a losing strategy to try to do exactly what the great power does. There's many reasons that might not work for you. You have different systems, different competitive advantages, and there's second mover disadvantages. For example, in my chapter on foreign policy, which I won't discuss today, China doesn't build alliances. And one of the main things they list is the second mover disadvantage, in that the United States got all the best allies. And so if they were going to build alliances, they would have to choose countries for which there was a lot of risk in that alliance and not a lot of benefit. What I argue is different from that emulation perspective. I call it the Upstart Strategy because it's devised from a lot of research done in the business literature about how new companies manage to enter and gain market share that are dominated by stronger companies or even monopolies. While the rise of other countries to great power status is relatively rare, the establishment and death of firms is actually quite common. And so this type of research is in some ways much more developed within the business community. But when I look at China, I think of it largely as an upstart. And I argue that they have built relative power in this competitive environment dominated by the United States, not by emulating, but pursuing this upstart strategy. And there's a few components to this. The first is they pursue different pathways to power that leverage their competitive advantages. So, a new pathway in the US history is things like building international institutions that didn't exist before after World War II, or pursuing soft power. That was kind of a US innovation. Those are different pathways to power. Secondly, China focuses on competing where competitive forces are the weakest. This can be because there's US blind spots. The United States isn't paying attention. There could be gaps in the international order. Ian Johnson has a paper about how certain orders are more or less stable. Some orders don't have a strong consensus around them. And so these really allow China to go in and shape those norms in those areas. And there also might be some vulnerabilities, an opening for China to blunt or undermine what the United States is trying to do. When China has deviated from this strategy and emulates the United States and tries to compete directly with the United States, it's had less success. So I'm not saying that they always do things differently, but for the most part, the major areas that have built power for China have been by doing something, differentiating themselves from the United States. Now, I also don't argue that they do everything differently. Of course, China has a Navy, for example. They have an Air Force. They have embassies, right? So there are some things that they're doing differently, though I believe that the differentiation is what has allowed them to rise to great power status. So there's a few conditions under which I argue emulation makes sense. The first one is a very political sciencey way when fixed costs of public goods are high, blah, 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 are basically saying if the other side is going to pay all the costs and you get the benefits, then efficiency wise, it really makes sense for you to emulate. So this is, why I think China is a part of a lot of international institutions, is that the United States has to pay to sustain the system of, free trade, and then China just gets to enter and benefit from it. There's also ways the United States have said this is legitimate. This is appropriate, and sometimes not doing those things is what sparks threat perceptions versus doing them. So sometimes doing the things that is emulation is more reassuring than it is threatening. And in a select few cases, even though China's the second mover, it might see itself as being able to outcompete. One area that I see this happening in is in the civilian space sector, where China spends about $8 billion and the United States spends $48 billion. And yet, because of the cheap cost of labor and in particular engineers, China has been able to build a lot of prestige by having a lot of firsts in space, like most recently landing on the far side of the moon. All right, so what does this look like in terms of military strategy? Well, first, since I've stopped with this situation of when to emulate, there are some situations in which China has emulated. The first I would say is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Now, again, when China emulates under these conditions, and this one is one that helps it build prestige, it presents itself as responsible, and actually allows it to reassure while it builds military powered influence. It's still a small part of overall strategy. They still do far less HADR, for example, than the United States does, but this is something that they engage in. So over the years, China has become increasingly involved in these overseas missions. They've expanded their involvement in terms of personnel and number of assets. And Chinese writings on HADR point to a number of benefits associated with this, in particular reputational benefits, as well as being able to improve their military capabilities, right? So it's a win-win. They get to improve command and control, small unit leadership, engineering, helicopter operations, logistics capabilities, or some things listed in the Chinese literature, but they also get bonus points, which everyone says, oh, we are reassured and we are happy because China is doing these types of things. So there are a lot of, there's political considerations currently. The United States has some legislation that tries to restrict the amount that the United States can cooperate with China, even in things like HADR, because of concerns that China is taking these gains and leveraging them to help them with more offensive combat operations. But for the most part, this is one area where China hasn't completely avoided the US strategy, though they haven't used it to the same degree as the United States. So here's a map that I've put together just to show you of where these types of operations are taking place. They have one ship called the Peace Ark, which is a medical ship. That's the red dots of where they've gone along the world. But as you can see for the other types of HADR responses, the vast majority of them are within China's region, right? Within Asia. That's where the main focus is. A big one that's kind of controversial that I like to talk about is China's nuclear strategy. And to say that China does things different is not just an intellectual argument, it's also really important for policy, because there's a lot of assumptions that China wants what the United States has, and that China is going to try to do exactly what the United States does. And so the next couple of examples, nuclear strategy, and then I'll talk about overseas military presence, are somewhat controversial because the assumption is that China basically wants to compete and have exactly what the US has. And in particular, we've seen some increase recently in China's nuclear arsenal. So people are concerned that they're going to try to rush to parity. My understanding of China's nuclear strategy is so far they've been relatively smart and not doing what the United States does. And that's how they've been able to compete so efficiently over the past 25 years. So the first thing is, since 1964, China has had a minimum deterrence with assured retaliation plus a no first use pledge. This is completely different than what the United States has. The United States doctrine, varies in aggressiveness depending on who is president, but it includes use against non-nuclear states. It often includes use even when there has been no nuclear use involved, that the United States can go first. And given the amount of weapons the United States has, over 5,000, it's not a minimum deterrence posture. China basically during the Cold War took a look at what was happening and said, okay, we need a handful of weapons to basically deter nuclear use, and that's it. So they conceptualize nuclear weapons differently. They're not war-fighting weapons. And that's why, and this is bullet point number 4, China does not have tactical nuclear weapons like the United States does. 30% of the US budget in dealing with nuclear weapons goes to tactical nuclear weapons. The United States doesn't have to, China doesn't have to spend that money because it doesn't have any. Over the past 25 years, China has increased its arsenal, right? And there's different debates of how many they have. So I put a few up here, 234, 320, whether they have 90 ICBMs that could deliver about 130 warheads to the continental United States. But whether you believe in the Chinese numbers of 150 or DIA numbers of a little bit more, China is clearly not trying to reach parity with the US arsenal of 5,800. Right? They have a different approach to nuclear weapons. And it's not only how many weapons they have that tells us that their strategy is different. Their delivery systems are also different. China has primarily focused on land-based delivery systems. 76% of China's force is land-based, while only 22% of the US nuclear force is land-based. China didn't even add the potential for a sea leg, so the ability to deliver nuclear weapons by submarine, till 2015. And it's arguable, right now we haven't actually seen any pairing with aircraft, so China doesn't really have a triad, though some Chinese media say that one of China's platforms, the H-6, could be paired with a nuclear warhead if need be. Their organizational structure is also completely different. The United States has sectioned off nuclear weapons to be under the auspices of Strategic Command, of STRATCOM, while China has combined conventional and nuclear missile forces together under the Strategic Rocket Force. So all their land-based systems are under the Strategic Rocket Force, along with their conventional ballistic and cruise missile systems. And then their sea leg, of course, is under the auspices of the Navy. So for the most part, China didn't look at the United States as a great power and say, we want to build this exactly the way that they built it. Of course, it was necessary to have nuclear weapons for the sake of deterrence, right? To that degree, emulation was a good idea. But then doing it in a way that was achieving the same goals, but at reduced cost, trying to pursue different efforts. Now, what I find interesting is that there is some imitation, but mostly in terms of their non-proliferation efforts. So there's a lot of research that sort of praised China for joining all these arms control arrangements. But if you look at the 17 multilateral arms control regimes that China has joined, 13 are about nuclear weapons, 2 are about biological chemical weapons, and 2 are about the regulation of conventional weapons. Most of the things that China is agreeing to based on its different approach, and they have a different approach to conventional sales as well, which I won't get a chance to cover in this talk, but because of this, they weren't going to do any of this stuff anyway. So this is an alternative argument to one that's very popular that Ian Johnston first promoted, that China was socialized through interaction with the international community to say that, they wanted arms control and they wanted non-proliferation. You could also say, well, it's also good because they could sign all these agreements that constrain the United States in significant ways, but do not constrain China. And that's just smart strategy. The second way that China, has thought about its military quite differently than the United States has to do with overseas presence. Now, you've probably heard, people have been talking forever about China's military. I just reviewed a book of a former student of mine, Rush Doshi, who says that China has the goal of dominating the world and it wants its military to dominate the world. And people have been saying this for a long time, and I'm going to show you some statistics. It's just the data just isn't there. And I think it's largely because China realizes that this is not a good way of competing. So to give you just some stats, the United States has 250,000 people overseas at any military members overseas at any given period of time. We have 120 overseas bases. We spend $20 billion a year on maintaining that presence, another $60 billion if we're going to do overseas contingency operations. This doesn't even include wars. One thing that I like to talk about a lot is that strategy is about choices, and whether we should or shouldn't, it's a separate issue. But the fact of the matter is that the 20 years in Afghanistan cost the same as 10 Belt and Road initiatives, which are the major economic initiative that China has to build power and influence throughout the world. The United States could have done 10 of those, but chose to fight a war in Afghanistan instead. The United States believes in foreign military intervention as a key tool of foreign policy. This is how the United States defends its overseas interests. And that's why we've had 105 military interventions since 1946. And these military interventions, you can see sort of the costs and focus over time. The bottom line is that we think that this is the only way to protect your overseas interests. And so we constantly assume that China is going to be building bases around the world, projecting power around the world to protect its overseas interests. Now, those interests have grown significantly, but China's approach has been completely different. First, they rely on host nation security. So they have really significant programs to train law enforcement of other countries to help that law enforcement protect their interests of that country. They have private contractors, and then they often they're the #1 contributor to peacekeeping operations under the Permanent Five, and they often make sure that peacekeeping operations are happening in certain places like Sudan, where they have economic interest, and that their peacekeepers can be there to protect those interests. They also can free ride off of others' militaries. So what people consider basing, it's not really basing. China has state-owned enterprises that have commercial ports around the world. Now, could these be used to support some types of military operations? Yes. Particularly things like non-combatant evacuations or humanitarian aid and disaster relief, but they're not designed and cannot support high-intensity combat. And so it's not the case that China right now is primarily trying to build the ability to protect its overseas interests in the way that the United States is. So for the sake of time, I'll skip through some of those details and just show you maybe the arms sales differences as well. So this is something else you hear a lot of like, China's selling so many arms and is competing with the United States to sell so many arms. This is one of the areas where they're exploiting blind spots. China, as you can see, compared to the United States, does not leverage arms sales as a key aspect of their strategy to build power. But they do sell arms to certain countries, basically those that are not serviced by the United States. They're not eager to compete with the United States because US product is better. And Chinese writers often, argue this, that, it's hard. Either a country is strategically important, so it gets loans, or it's rich, and so it prefers to buy from the United States. So China really only has the option of selling to countries where there's a low cost, high impact, basically meaning countries that the United States will not sell to. Maybe they're too poor, so they can't really afford US weapons like Bangladesh, or because there's arms embargoes against those countries like Myanmar. China respects UN arms embargoes, but they don't respect just US arms embargoes. So that's one that they go along with. And they also sell certain types of systems that the United States can't sell because of treaties. So things like unmanned aerial vehicles is one area. Because of a previous treaty about cruise missiles, the United States couldn't sell those types of things. So I have some other examples in here. I know we are short of time, so I'll skip ahead to one of the failing things I wanted to point out: soft power. Soft power is an area where the Communist Party decided this is a key pathway to power for the United States, and they wanted to emulate it. They wrote, the party announced in 2007 that it was an important component of their comprehensive national power and international competitiveness, and they would seek to imitate the United States in this area. In the book, I go through all the different statistics. The bottom line is the Chinese spent has spent a lot of money trying to build up their soft power. Under Xi Jinping, for example, Beijing ramped up spending from 4.6 billion to 9.5 billion for public diplomacy efforts. This compares to only 2.19 billion from the United States in the same year. So the United States is spending, maybe close to a fifth of what China is spending. But then when it comes to all the rankings of, whether it is global brands or which movies do you like to watch more, or even foreign policy, it's true that US rankings in soft power decreased under President Trump, but they went from being number 1 to like number 4. And China, the highest they've ever gotten in the rankings is 24. And this is largely because, this does not meet the conditions I laid out where emulation makes sense. China does not have a competitive advantage because soft power is largely built on civil society, of which China doesn't have any. And so this was not an area where they should be trying to directly compete, but they decided to anyway. Now, there's a few things in which China's top-down, heavy-handed approach can work, maybe with, Olympics, the 2008 Olympics, when they could throw a lot of money at opening ceremonies. We can see now, even with the Olympics, it hasn't helped their soft power, or maybe vaccine diplomacy. But the bottom line is, if China does try to emulate and compete directly with the United States in areas that do not meet those very narrow conditions of emulation, I don't see this as a threat. If anything, I see this as how the United States gains a competitive advantage. So I'm not fearful of China rushing to parity in nuclear weapons, or China trying to build bases overseas, because I think this would make China much less competitive. And in the Q&A, we can talk about a lot of other aspects in which China is not emulating the United States, whether it be its A2AD, its anti-access area denial approach, its focus on 3 warfare, so psychological, public opinion, and lawfare, as well as gray zone tactics to achieve territorial aims versus conventional military power. There's a lot of different examples of this, but the bottom line is, I think we have to start thinking about things a bit differently, more from Beijing's perspective and less from Washington's perspective, to understand how they've been able to successfully build enough power in the past 25 years, from going from a country that the sort of US Department of Defense dismissed as a peasant army to one in which can take on the United States in all domains. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Oriana. And thanks to the people who are beginning to populate the Q&A box. I remind you that it's there, and invite more to post questions. I'd like to use the prerogative of the chair to ask some initial questions. One has to do with the objectives of China's buildup, as you described it, which goes back and forth between a description of military activities and call it total power. That is it your argument that China's highest objective is to displace the United States atop the international system, and that its policies are formulated, its priorities are set against that objective? What does it have to do in order to displace the United States? Or is the military component and others that you mentioned simply elements in a much larger bundle of objectives? Increasing prosperity, narrowing inequalities, improving healthcare, responding to generational demands for elder care, and so forth. Is what you describe the result of single-minded pursuit of a comprehensive strategy, or is that the more serendipitous outcome of decisions taken for a variety of reasons over a period of time?
So if I had to choose between those two, I would say it's the latter. It's not like they had the sole objective of displacing the United States, but one key part of my argument is that one of the main focal points that helps them determine which direction to go is US strategy, right? So that part of the book is, for each of these sort of mini cases, I go into, party documents, elite thinking on that are often weighing these options. Should we pursue alliances? Shouldn't we? And of course, what the United States is doing and how the United States will respond is a primary factor that determines the pathway they decide to go. So in that way, the United States really shapes what China does. Now, that just tells China, okay, I'm not going to build overseas bases, but it doesn't tell China what to do, like what should be the alternative pathway. And I think that's largely determined by domestic factors, in particular, China's understanding of its own competitive advantages. But this question of kind of what China wants, I guess I find it less interesting than the how. So the book is mainly on the how China builds power. And I try, it's kind of a cheat, but I have this whole chapter in which I basically just show that by any metric anyone has listed, economic, military, prestige, China, we can now determine that China is a great power. And so it's hard in each individual categories to say, is this a success or not a success? But I would say overall, they've succeeded enough that they've managed to build this power. And while I don't have a smoking gun to say that the government deliberately has this plan in which okay, what are our new pathways to power? What are the blind spots? There's consistency across all the different realms that suggests that this is kind of a comprehensive competitive approach. And I don't think that the leaders of China, I don't think have completely decided what they want yet. I think basically they want to build enough power to have strategic space to make the decisions they want to make in the moment they want to make them that they deem are best for China. Now, of course, there's some things we're more certain about, like they want unification with Taiwan. But when it comes to, for example, what does China want its role to be in the world? I think they're still very much, picking up the stones to cross the river. But the bottom line is when they make those decisions, when they say okay, now we want to have made in China 2025, we want to be self-sufficient in technology, they have that option because they've built this power. Or if they want to take Taiwan by force, maybe they have that option because they had a foreign policy strategy designed to convince countries that Taiwan is a unique scenario. And so I think they want strategic space, and the United States wants to shape Chinese behavior. And that's kind of why we're at a loggerheads on this.
We're beginning to get many questions, so I will hold some others that I would like to ask. One is from Mark Warburton. What do you think is the biggest threat to U.S. power projection?
Oh, there's so many. So the number one, so there's two, I guess it's short-term, long-term power projection. The most immediate threat is the United States cannot defend its bases in Asia. So this has been something that people have been working on for a very long time. The bottom line is the United States has very few bases in the vicinity of some of these conflicts we're considering. Like for example, with respect to Taiwan, China has 39 air bases in the vicinity of Taiwan. The United States has 1. And China basically just has to put a couple holes in the runways and we can't take off anymore. So that is a big threat because the United States needs air superiority to be able to defend Taiwan and engage in operations. In the longer term, if we're talking about projection from continental United States, I would say it's China's threat to US space assets. Same type of thing. It's really low risk and low cost for China to mess with US space assets. Some things that they have at their disposal, are even reversible. Most people know maybe about the anti-satellite test. That's a kinetic kill vehicle. That was a bit controversial, but China can, do things as basic as, shining lights into our satellites. Like I have a 3-year-old that whenever he gets a flashlight, he wants to shine it right in your eyes. And the few seconds after a light has been shown in your eyes that you have all that white light and you can't really see anything. Well, it's the same type of technology with satellites. China can get close to them and do something like that. So the United States relies completely on space for power projection, in particular for communications, navigation, for all this stuff. And China can so easily disrupt our satellites and our uplinks and our downlinks. And so this is one of the big issues if we're talking about a longer war in which we're trying to flow forces into the theater, then it's probably space.
I'm going to draw upon a couple of questions to ask a combined one, which has to do with the fruits of being acknowledged to be a major power. China acknowledged to be a major power. Part of it is China is a major power because it says it is. A great many places and people around the world say China is a great power because it has a big economy and because it says it is. But what are some concrete examples of China's ability to influence events that are greater now because of the things that you described in the United Nations, Security Council votes, in competition for hearts and minds in Europe or in Africa? Is over the period that you describe, if my recollection is correct, that the polling on the image of China has gone down everywhere. Military buildup, Belt and Road Initiative, humanitarian activities, that it's elicited from a variety of countries support for its position on Taiwan, refusal to meet with the Dalai Lama, refusal to boycott the Olympics or criticize what's happening in Xinjiang. Beyond those, probably make people in Beijing feel a little better. What are the concrete accomplishments or benefits or fruits of the policy and approach you described? Presumably they have them, or they wouldn't continue it.
Yeah, so I think that question kind of sets things up strangely, because it kind of starts with like the things that are important to China shouldn't be important to China. So can I think of things that have been successful according to a metric that wouldn't be successful to them? Like, I think the fact, so there's a lot of Chinese writing about how countries now accommodate Chinese preferences. Now we might dismiss it as being like, oh, it's just about Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, but it is, or not, even in the United Nations, it would be impossible to sort of, condemn China for certain types of things. But that's really, that kind of sovereignty is really important to them. So I think they think, major power status allows them that type of freedom. I had a Chinese official once say to me, being a great power means you can do whatever you want and no one will have anything to say about it. I would also say that China's popularity has not decreased everywhere in the world. In the developed world, it has, but in a lot of the developing world, China is still widely popular. In Africa, for example, I think the United States, we too often, I don't think we've had a strategy for the developing world as, well, at least as long as I have kind of been focused on these issues. Well, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, has been very clear that he wants to be, the leader of, the global South and the developing world. So when we think about, where have there been areas, I think you could think about every possible foreign policy back and forth, like when the United States tried to get countries not to have 5G in their country, and those countries said, no, we're going to let China build 5G here. Or when we talk about, the AI, the surveillance systems, I might have a chart here, that the United States was like, we don't want people buying these Chinese systems. And countries, here's a graphic of it. Countries said too bad. And it's not even just, autocracies. About 51% of those buying these technologies were liberal democracies, buying them for public safety and other reasons. And so in a lot of cases, when we think about like, is it, for development assistance and loans that 80 something percent of the companies winning out on bids are Chinese companies, things like that. We think, okay, that's how China is ensuring that those countries are going the direction that benefits them. Like even when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, the fact that the Taliban met with China and made a commitment to ensure the protection of Chinese resources in Afghanistan, that's something that you get because you're a major power. So we've recently seen, we talk about this backlash of like, but we've been talking about backlash for a long time. I think for the first time, we actually see some costly indicators, like, Australia going with AUKUS basically said that Australia is going to prioritize security over economics. But most of Southeast Asia is not prioritizing security over economics. They most definitely prioritize their relationship with China over even their security relationship with the United States. And so that's when I go to, like, why do you want power? It's so whatever it is that you want in that moment, whether it is for Muslim countries to sign a letter saying you treat Uyghurs perfectly fine, to you want to host the Olympics, and so you're going to ensure you get the Olympics bid, to you're going to be able to gather data and from all over the world to support your own AI enabled machine learning efforts, so you can be number one in technology. All of that, China can achieve because of its major power status. And I will say it's not just China. So in the chapter on what makes a great power, I do have a whole section of constructivists that talk about a lot of it just has to do if that status is conferred to you. It's not just China, but it's also, I think, partly the United States with the 2017 National Security Strategy, which said we're in a great power competition with China, that we basically conferred that great power status onto China.
Question from Rose Gadamola. She invites you to comment on US Stratcom leadership observations. The Chinese are rapidly modernizing their nuclear force structure, including quintupling the number of warheads.
Yeah, I think they should. So the way, the Chinese for a long time didn't have a second strike capability. And as things have gotten tenser with the United States, this has been a main focus of their modernization, right? And Rose knows this more than I do. Moving away from liquid to solid fuels, moving away from silos to more mobile systems. But, they have increased concerns about US missile defense, and they have increased concerns about US nuclear doctrine, which has never ruled out striking first. And so I think that China is still maintaining this limited assured deterrence posture. They've just come to the conclusion that, if they're going to absorb an attack and then launch and have to get some weapons through a very advanced missile defense system, then maybe what they had going for them wasn't enough. And it's my understanding, even looking at the photos of the silos that they have, or take into account the fissile material that they have, that that they're not trying to build another 5,000. Like people, Stratcom doesn't like the idea that they're building any more, but I actually think it would be much more stabilizing if China was more confident in its nuclear posture. And I prefer them, building more nuclear weapons to making significant advancements in technologies like hypersonics, which is another way they're dealing with missile defense, which have significant conventional capabilities as well. China doesn't have the ability to hit the United States with conventional weapons. And so if we're in a war in which the United States is hitting mainland China, they don't have a lot of options. And the further development of hypersonics are going to give them that option. So I would prefer that they try to increase their number of nuclear weapons than make advancements in delivery systems if I had the choice between the two. But obviously anything they do that improves their capabilities, we're going to be concerned about. But I don't think it's enough to signal a change in Chinese nuclear strategy. I think they're still with an assured retaliation posture.
Jim Goldgeier asks or invites you to comment on Rostoshi's argument that that focuses on Chinese rhetoric and changes over time. And the question is that change significant?
So I wrote a review of Russia's book, and there's some aspects of the book that I really, really like. I would assign it in all my classes. It's very readable. It gives a good history of kind of, Chinese thinking and policy over time. The issue, I think, when you're trying to figure out, like, over the past 25 years, what has actually happened here is sort of twofold. The first is that Rush kind of argues that China had changed strategies from like a blunting strategy to a building to a domination strategy. I actually see components of all those strategies consistent throughout Chinese strategy. So they're still engaging in some blunting, some building, and there are some areas where they might want that kind of dominance. But when Rush looks at certain Chinese discourse, so for example, the discourse on overseas bases that he puts in his article or in his book. Of course, there were some voices in China that were like, we want to, build this big Navy and we want to do all these things with it. But there were stronger voices saying this is a horrible idea. And those Chinese sources, for whatever, reason, one way or another, were not included in Russia's analysis. And so in some of the debates, I think, one, he doesn't necessarily capture the whole debate that is existing within China about a certain issue. And the second thing, and this is largely because it's not his goal, he's not trying to see whether China is building power through these efforts, right? So he doesn't actually look at whether or not these were good pathways. So one example of this is the aircraft carrier program, in which he talks about how China is now building aircraft carriers. This is one of my examples in my military chapter of China deciding to emulate. That's actually a very bad idea, because all the statistics show that China is pouring money into this program and the aircraft carriers are far inferior to those of the United States. China was much better off pursuing more anti-access area denial pathways. And so I would say that Russia and I are probably on the same page with the fact that China wants to be able to influence decisions in every corner of the world. I don't think there's enough evidence to say they want to do that militarily. I think they probably largely want to do that politically and economically. And my main question that I'm interested in is less, I think what Russia is trying to show us is that China always had this plan to become a great power. And I think that's absolutely right. But Avery Goldstein and others before Russia have shown that it's not, Xi Jinping isn't new. The strategy of rejuvenation to become a great power. China made a deliberate decision in the 1990s to turn its economic might into this great power status. And so, and then to look to the United States to say, we need to compete in certain types of areas. So that's absolutely right. My main question is, how do they manage to do it? And that's what my main focus is on in this book.
There are several questions about the South China Sea, and combining what I think is the central point here. How do China's actions in the South China Sea, from the attention to the 9-dash line, to the construction of islands, to the refusal to first attend and then abide by the ICJ judgment on law of the sea, to the treatment of fishing boats, other nations? Is this a manifestation of great power status that makes China look like a good neighbor that has cultivated support in and outside of the region? Or does it make China look like just another bully?
So I think the question of whether China is a bully or not a bully is less important than whether China is succeeding or not succeeding. Well, at least when I look at a lot of the Chinese writings, they would say, we might see it differently, but they would say that it's natural for countries to feel threatened by China, given that China is increasing in power. So, they would point out that China threat theory, this idea that China could be a potential threat to other countries and their neighbors, started in the mid-1990s when they actually didn't have any significant military power to be threatening with. And so a lot of the Chinese domestic discourse is like, yes, they recognize that the international environment has deteriorated. They recognize that other countries potentially see them as a threat, but many kind of see like that's going to happen no matter what. So if that's a given, then the question is, can China achieve its goals? And that's really where I think a lot of the focus is on. And they don't see that like, oh, if they did things differently, if they said, they did things differently, then countries wouldn't find them threatening. I would also say that in the South China Sea, China has the option of taking those islands by force. And they didn't, and they haven't. This goes back to my argument of, not doing things so directly. It's very interesting that instead China pursued this really complex lawfare argument about, what you can regulate within your exclusive economic zone and putting it into domestic law, and then building a coast guard to say they were enforcing domestic law to harass fishing vessels, which confused the United States for like a decade. For a decade, the US military was like, we can't respond because they're not using their Navy, and it'd be disproportionate for us to bring our Navy in there when they're only using a Coast Guard. Like, and how can we respond aggressively, to statements about legalese, about like what is theirs and what isn't? And so they successfully basically consolidated their position in the South China Sea, building 3,200 acres of military bases, and then, basically convincing other countries to concede in some ways in terms of maybe not verbally, but in terms of how present they are and how active they are in certain areas of the South China Sea, to accept that China was going to be the dominant power there, and they didn't have to fight a war with anyone to do that. And so in some cases, I think that's really what the interesting thing is. If they had come out and attacked a bunch of countries, took those islands and put some sort of blockade and told countries they had to stay out, the United States would have recognized that immediately as a threat. Instead, it took us like 10 years to get around to the idea that these sort of gray zone activities and things with a lot of deniability of like Chinese fishermen harassing US vessels versus Chinese military. I mean, China knew we just didn't know how to respond to something like that. And so this is one area where I think, pursuing that different pathway to, in this case, consolidating their position on territorial disputes allowed them to get a lot of, make significant advances at very minimal cost.
Question from Hale Swift. Do you think China will be able to sustain its current rising trajectory and reach predominance? Or do you see a likelihood that China will soon, or maybe already is beginning to have to trim back because of demographic reasons, economic reasons, that China is already discovering it can't afford many of its ambitious objectives, that an unstoppable juggernaut, inevitably destined to outpace the slow-footed Americans, or in significant danger of losing the benefits that it has accrued from its economic growth and from being perceived as unstoppable?
So the bottom line is, I have no idea. I have no idea which it is. But I will tell you what I do know and what drives at least my assessments and my strategic inputs. A few things. I do know that even if the Chinese economy becomes completely stagnant, all right, let's just say they have, no economic growth, and by some strange situation, even though we're in a globalized environment, China's economy is suffering significantly, but no one else's is. Okay, well, we're just doing like a hypothetical. There's a stagnant in the United States, we're just doing just fine. Even under those circumstances, China is still going to have the second largest economy in the world, at least for the next couple of decades, at least for the rest of my career in which I'm doing this. And they will have more resources to compete with the United States in the next 25 years than they have had the past 25, right? So I just look at all the things they could do from that weaker resource position over the past 25 years. And I think they're going to be even in a better position, even if they do have stagnant growth over the next 25. So I don't think we can kind of rule. We're still going to be having to compete. This problem isn't going to go away on its own. We're not going to be able to say, and I'll tell you that for a very long time, this was the very popular view at the Pentagon. It was like, China will collapse and then we won't have to deal with China anymore. Now, that the mechanisms they were always talking about is like the people of China are going to rise against the government. They're going to collapse. We won't have to deal with this. Now everyone's like, the economy is going to collapse. So, so that's how we're going to win the competition. So I will say that we'll have to compete even if the economy is stagnant. And secondly, I just prefer, I think it can lead to lazy strategy, to be like, China is going to resolve this problem for us. And the third thing I will say is, based on a lot of my research, I'm very reluctant to say that, China can or cannot deal with certain things, or should not do certain things, because I know that we have these cognitive biases in which we underestimate the ability of our opponents to do things when they face different challenges, or they address those challenges differently than we do, that it's in our minds to dismiss them and say, that's never going to work. I think a lot of the people who look at China, they point to all sorts of metrics, but I think a lot of that is like a taxi company looking at Uber and saying, well, we own more cars. It's like, yeah, that's true, But is that the determinant of power in this century? Is that really what's important? And so I think for the sake of my book project, I say that there's this ongoing debate. Will China surpass the United States? Will China remain stagnant? At the very least, I think scholars on both sides of that can agree that China has accumulated a significant amount of power over the past 25 years. And if we can't figure out how they were able to do that from a weaker resource position, again, in the system that was completely dominated by the United States, then I think it's harder for us to figure out what to do the next 25 years in terms of designing a US competitive approach for dealing with China. So that's probably somewhat dissatisfying, because I tell you, it's like, I hear both of those arguments too. I ask economists on both sides, and I don't have a strong ability to independently assess what I'm reading on the econ side.
And so we've got a great many questions. I'll apologize in advance that unable to get to a great many of them. But an appropriate one, I hope it's not the last one, but it will be one of the last. Given rapidly rising tensions between the United States and China, are there ways to de-escalate the military buildup, presumably on both sides, and other strategic interactions between these two states?
Well, I mean, you probably have to ask someone else this question, because in all my government work, all I'm doing is trying to argue for the military buildup. So now I'm trying to get out of my head and say, okay, well, like if I didn't think, so I really do think that the United States has to improve its force posture in Asia to maintain deterrence against China. And so I think it would be a really bad idea for the United States to sort of disengage somehow, even if it did lead to a reduction of tensions with China. I mean, the bottom line is I think we can either deter China and they're unhappy, or China's undeterred and they're happy. I find it very hard, at least in the military realm, to come up with solutions for both. Of course, should we continue to have strategic interaction with China? Absolutely. I hope. I used to do translations for Militant Mills. I think all of that is very fruitful. As a China specialist, who speaks Chinese, I find spending time in China and learning more and interacting more is absolutely fruitful. We should be as open to academic exchanges, military exchanges as possible, to learn more about each other and to try to find a third way. I haven't found one yet, but obviously I think we should continue to try it as these tensions increase.
This will be the last question, and it's been asked in various ways by a number of people. If you were the president, if you were advising the president, how should the United States respond to the developments that you've described?
Oh man, I'm calling over there, yelling at them all the time about stuff. All right, so let me. Some of the things I say while I'm on my soapbox, like first and foremost, US-China competition is not about China. It's about the United States' role in the rest of the world. And we can no longer ignore 90% of the world. The United States has this approach in which we have our strategic partners, right? We're like, well, as long as we got Japan, Israel, Korea, maybe Australia, throw in the UK, like we're good. And then we ignore everyone else. And then we go out there and we say, we're a better partner than China. The problem is the US message. It's not the US message. For a lot of countries, we have not historically been a good partner. We talk about Chinese coercion, and then we have a history of engaging in coercive activities against a lot of countries, especially in the developing world. And so, one, I absolutely think the United States needs to have a strategy to improve its position in the developing world that's beyond just messaging. Two, I think that has to do with completely revamping how we do development assistance. We're not in any way meeting the demands of the developing world because Congress focuses on, their pet projects of where they want to send money versus the actual demands of the rest of the world. Three, we have to stop this whole democracy, autocracy type of language. It oversimplifies the situation. And I don't think the United States just wants to work with democracies. At the very least, when I'm giving inputs on government documents, I change that to aspiring democracies or, respecting democratic principles, because we just have to move beyond this idea that our way is the only way. It's not attractive. What's attractive about China is not that China is an autocracy. What's attractive is that China is regime neutral, that they say to a lot of other countries, you're different. You want to do things differently, and we accept that. And for all of that, we need to have experts on the rest of the world. Because people come to me and they'll say, how can we build our power and influence in Africa, given that China's, rising there? And I'm like, I don't know anything about Africa. I'm a China specialist, so I can tell you what China's doing. But until we really invest at home and value regional expertise such that we have people who speak, Vietnamese, as many people that speak Vietnamese in China, we're going to have a very hard time making headway. And the last thing I will say is, China is not, someone asked me yesterday, is like China the greatest threat we've ever faced? And I would say, that's really hard, because I don't think that China is the most dangerous threat we've ever faced. The bottom line is they want things that are different than the US, that are not good for us. But it's not like they're a revolutionary power that completely, wants to occupy other nations. I mean, Taiwan aside, they don't have plans to occupy anyone else. And so we have to keep that in mind, that actually there could be worse worlds of China's that act in worse ways, that are completely detached from the United States and its allies. And so we should continue to encourage the kind of engagement, understanding that we need to be competitive, and realize, and I think the Biden administration gets this, a lot of our competitiveness has to do with what we're doing at home and not what China's doing. So, improving our own immigration reform, education, stuff like that. That's my hope, is that competition drives us to be better here first, be better partners around the world second, and then maybe be able to stand up to China more third.
Several of the entries into the Q&A are not questions, but they are appropriate as the closer. And that is that they thank you, Oriana, for the presentation and the informative discussion. And I will add my own endorsement of that. Thanks and appreciation. You've covered a lot of material. Wish you good luck in completing the book project, and hope to have you leading another CSAC seminar soon. So thank you, everyone who has tuned in for this, and thank you, Oriana, for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, and stay posted. I'm hoping to have it drafted by the end of the year. We'll see.
Good.